Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about guilty verdicts in the ComEd 4 trial, the status of lawsuits against Illinois' gun ban, and more. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McClain to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McClain and DC Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. Reaction was swift from Illinois lawmakers following Tuesday's guilty verdicts in the ComEd 4 bribery trial. Kevin Bessler reports.
Former ComEd lobbyist John Hooker, one-time City Club President Jay Doherty, political insider Michael McClain, and former ComEd CEO Anne Pramaggiore were all found guilty in a scheme to sway former House Speaker Michael Madigan to benefit ComEd. State Representative Ryan Spain said, "It is a sad day for the state of Illinois."
This is embarrassing. For too long, we have allowed the poor ethical behavior of people like Mike Madigan, his associates, and others to become the way we do business in the state of Illinois. And unfortunately, the Madigan way is still the way in which our government works here in Springfield.
Madigan, who resigned after losing the House speakership in January 2021, has been charged with 23 counts of racketeering, bribery, and official misconduct in a case that could go to trial next year. I'm Kevin Bessler.
After a federal jury found former ComEd executives and lobbyists guilty of all charges related to influencing longtime Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, one legal analyst provides insight into what that means for the former House Speaker. Andrew Hensel has more.
Madigan is facing his own corruption charges. St. Xavier professor Dave Parker says this week's outcome does not bode well for Madigan.
If I was him, if there's an indicator here that he's got some problems, maybe. I think Trevor said there was some really convincing and robust evidence.
Parker says that he would not be surprised to see Madigan's team raise issues of having an unfair trial.
And again, his name came up throughout the trial and all. So I don't know if they're going to, how they're going to posture themselves, whether or not they're going to say they can get a fair trial with all this publicity going on.
Madigan faces over 20 charges and has pleaded not guilty. His trial is scheduled for next spring. I'm Andrew Hensel.
The preliminary injunction against Illinois' gun and magazine ban has been reversed by the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. Last Friday, Southern District of Illinois Judge Stephen McGlynn issued a preliminary injunction against the state, preventing it from enforcing the ban while the case continues. Gun rights advocate Todd Vandermeide said one gun store told him they had their largest volume of sales ever.
I was at a gun store yesterday, and he just got in a pile of firearms to restock his shelves and all that. So, the gun stores, things are moving again. The
state asked McGlynn to stay his injunction. After the judge scheduled briefings, the state motioned with the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals to intervene and reverse the injunction. Vandermeide said the state is, quote, stamping their feet.
They're just like, you got it wrong and the other judges up north got it right. And I'm not sure that's the appropriate tact to take in this case.
Late Thursday afternoon, the appeals court issued a stay on McGlynn's injunction, giving respondents until May 9th to reply. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McClain. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Between the Consumer Price Index, inflation, and job reports, it feels like you need a PhD in economics to fully understand the economic news happening around us every day. That's why you need the Everyday Economics Podcast. Join host Chris Krug and economist Dr. Orphe Devungi as they help you understand the economic world happening around you every day. Listen to the Everyday Economics Podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McClain, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, our Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. Greg, how are you?
Dan, I'm well and ready for the state legislature to wrap up in just a couple of weeks' time.
Aren't you lucky? Yeah, we're just a couple of weeks away, aren't we?
And May 19th, they are adjourning, and they've got a lot to do, including passing the state budget.
That's right. Which we probably won't see until like a few hours before, and it's going to be in a couple thousand word or pages form. But that's another story.
And it might drop at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and then they'll vote on it at 4 o'clock in the morning. Who knows? We shall see.
All right. Before we get into legislative stuff, though, Greg, we have huge news this week. The last several weeks, probably close to 2 months now, we've been talking about the ComEd 4 federal corruption and bribery trial that's been going on in Chicago in a federal district court. Well, this week, after several days of deliberations, the jury rendered its verdict. Our Brett Rowland was in the courtroom to hear the verdict, and we had guilty on all counts on all 4 defendants. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so of course, 7 weeks of a trial where there was bombshell evidence and wiretap recordings and undercover video recordings and documents that were presented by prosecutors. 4 defendants, all charged with a bribery and conspiracy scheme involving ComEd, one of the state's largest utilities. And what they alleged was a nearly decade-long bribery scheme to curry favor from former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan in exchange for favorable legislation for the utility. So we had, of course, all of the documents, all of the evidence presented, and defense pushing back, essentially saying this is, just the common course of lobbying and getting things done at the State House. But after hearing all of the evidence, seeing the videos, looking at the documentation, hearing the closing arguments, the jurors, they came back unanimously. And I think that's something important that needs to be noted about the judiciary in this country. When you have a trial by a jury, it can take just one juror not going along with a guilty verdict to derail that particular verdict. So unanimous consent across the jury on all 4 defendants being found guilty. I think one juror said that they're tired of political corruption, and this is an indication that a jury of their peers found them guilty on all counts, and they could face up to 20 years in prison. Now, former House Speaker Michael Madigan, Dan, he was central in all of the prosecutors' presentations and their accusations. He wasn't on trial this week, but this is obviously a sign of what could be down the road for Madigan whenever he faces trial next year.
Right. We'll get into Madigan's part in this whole thing here in a minute. Greg, he does face 23 corruption-related counts to this, the ComEd conspiracy, and other issues. But as you mentioned, there are 12 jurors here. And all it took was one to derail it, to derail any of the charges. I'm going to say I was a little bit surprised that they were guilty on every single count, on every single defendant. That just goes to show our judicial system spoke, and it appears to work. Not a single juror dissented on any of the counts. And as you mentioned, one of the jurors spoke after the trial, after the verdict came out, and essentially speaking for the jury, she said, "We're tired of political corruption. We're hoping this is a first step." Well, not to interpret her words, but this is a first step in this ongoing federal prosecution. Sentencing has not been scheduled yet, but as you say, they face up to 20 years each in prison. The next step could be next year when Madigan is scheduled to go on trial on these 23, I should say, not just former Speaker Madigan, but his associate who was convicted in this ComEd 4 trial, Michael McClain. They're both set to go to trial next year on these separate charges. Your team, Greg, at the Center Square, Illinois, talked to a legal analyst and talked about what this verdict means this week and how it bodes for Madigan next year. What did he tell us?
Yeah, so St. Xavier University professor David Parker, we've talked with him a lot about these corruption cases, and he's been tracking this along with the rest of everybody who's been watching this. And from the get-go, he said that the evidence the prosecutors provide is going to be very revealing, and it really has been with the wiretap recordings, the undercover video recordings. It really kind of lifted the veil, so to speak, on the thinking behind offering up little to do nothing jobs for associates of a very powerful politician. Keep in mind, Madigan wasn't just the House Speaker. He was also the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois, which controlled the party purse. And there's always been that error around Madigan that he would withhold money from Democrats if they didn't fall in line. And all of this, of course, as he had that apex of power, controlling multiple big dollar political funds, while also being the House Speaker. And Parker highlighting how the outcome of this week's verdict is going to be instructive for Madigan and his defense next year. And there could be a variety of different ways this goes, including possibly the Madigan defense saying that the media coverage there's been on the ComEd 4 trial could, in a way, prejudice a future jury. So could that be an argument made? Regardless, a lot of the evidence presented we may see brought back up for the Madigan trial next year, and we could see even new evidence brought forward. So time will tell, but obviously this is a big message being sent across the political spectrum here in Illinois.
Yeah, certainly not a fly on the wall at Madigan's house. And if I were walking in his shoes, I'd be a little bit concerned right now. You mentioned not only was he the powerful House Speaker for 38 years. He was the Democratic Party chairman for 20 years. You mentioned he threatened Democratic lawmakers who didn't get in line behind him, who didn't toe his line, with primarying them. And he did that many different times throughout his career. He got Democratic legislators who did not do his bidding. He got opponents against them in their primaries, spent money on the opponents who eventually won their election. So he will face a peer of his juries at some point next year, likely. Greg, there was also fallout from this. Of course, this ComEd 4 corruption trial. It's not the first corruption trial related to Illinois politicians. Brett Rowland, who was in the courtroom, as I mentioned, he did a follow-up story after the verdict, pointing out that 4 of Illinois' last 10 governors served prison time after their convictions. This is, at least on the Republican side, this is spawned calls for ethics cleanup at the State House.
And a lot to be spoken about that, especially with previous ethics packages leading to what some saw was unsavory, especially with, for instance, the Legislative Inspector General. That's the independent body that fields complaints against legislators and investigates those and may find certain findings and report those out. They passed legislation several years ago that the former Legislative Inspector General actually ended up resigning over, saying that they made the office a paper tiger, really not having any true independence. So that's one area, but there's also, it's not just the ethics laws and more lobbying, transparency, and more documentation to show where money's coming from when it comes to lobbying efforts, and those types of disclosures and filings. But it's also rules. It's how the House conducts itself, and these are the rules that they approve every General Assembly. And it's something that Madigan crafted over his many years in power. And Republicans are saying they don't want to just see the strong ethics laws that should pass, they say, but they also want to see changes in how House rules allow for certain legislation to advance, or who can hold legislation up, or how committees advance different bills. There's obviously a lot of conversation that Republicans are hoping to have, but as it's 2 weeks left for the state legislature this spring session, whether or not they're going to bring about any substantive ethics reforms and rule changes, that has yet to remain seen.
Current House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welsh, who replaced Madigan in 2020 after Madigan didn't have the votes to win another term as House Speaker, promised when he was elected Speaker that it was a brand new day in Springfield. Republicans have said over the past 2+ years, though it's not a brand new day, that his rules, as you mentioned, are very similar to Madigan's rules. Republicans can't get their legislation to the House floor for votes, etc. Yesterday, State Representative Blaine Willauer, a Republican from Beecher City, took to the House floor and essentially blamed Democrats for turning a blind eye to this culture of corruption. Any response there?
It's not just Wilhauer making these statements. You've also have State Representative Ryan Spain, who was actually part of the legislative special investigative committee that they created in the latter part of 2020, where they were trying to get more information about Madigan's involvement in the then ComEd deferred prosecution agreement, which really broke this wide open back in the summer of 2020. And Ryan Spain, he told us a week or so ago that the state lawmakers can take a master class on ethics reforms just by looking at all of the evidence that there was on the ComEd 4 case, and how that could be very instructive to finding the loopholes and all of the changes that are necessary to clean up ethics in Illinois. But Spain also put out a note today critical of the House Speaker, saying nothing has changed since Madigan's indictment to prevent his type of behavior, and nothing will change until the majority party gets serious about ending corruption and reforming the Madigan rules, which govern the House of Representatives. He says that Welch is Madigan's handpicked successor, and the Speaker of the House, Lisa Hernandez, is the chairperson of the Democratic Party of Illinois, and they have to address this moving forward. I asked the Speaker's office for a response and have yet to hear back.
Well, Greg, again, thank you for your insight into this story. Our listeners can continue following this story at thecentersquare.com, but let's move on, Greg. There have been some significant developments in the lawsuits challenging Illinois' new gun ban. Last Friday, a federal court issued a preliminary injunction blocking enforcement of the ban statewide. But then late yesterday afternoon, Thursday afternoon, an appellate court stepped in and said, not so fast. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this all stems out of the Southern District of Illinois, where you had 4 plaintiffs groups, consolidated cases being heard April 12th by Judge Stephen McGlynn. And he, weeks later, as you said, on Friday, issued a preliminary injunction, which is an initial hold on the law, the first statewide hold on the law since the law was enacted back on January 10th. So that comes Friday. And then all weekend long last weekend, we saw social media. We heard from gun stores. They saw large numbers of sales, people showing up out the door, dozens of people waiting in line. Gun stores had to turn people around, saying they didn't have the capacity to take care of them that day. They would have to come back early the next day. So sales were very high level, very high volume. Some gun stores saying that they've seen the highest levels since when 2020 and COVID and civil unrest happened, if not before then. So gun sales were back on. People buying, some of them more than 170 semi-automatic firearms and pistols and shotguns and rifles, and also magazines. People were buying their magazines that are 30 rounds for a rifle, or more than 15 rounds for handguns. So gun stores were back in business, essentially, with that preliminary injunction put in place. But after the judge in the Southern District issued that preliminary injunction, the state asked that judge, Stephen McGlynn, to issue a stay on his own injunction. Well, McGlynn, he gave a schedule for the plaintiffs in that case to respond to the state's motion for a stay, and he set that for May 8th. The state then leapt over to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and directly appealed to the Seventh Circuit to issue a stay on McGlynn's order. So all that happened Friday and late Friday last week. Well, after about 6 days of strong sales at gun stores across the state, you had the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals issue a stay on that preliminary injunction late Thursday. And that put a halt to gun sales advancing forward. I did talk with GAT Guns, and they're out of East Dundee, and they said that they saw large volumes of sales for those 6 days. And then when the word came in late Thursday, it was like a faucet being turned off, and they had to halt all gun sales. The biggest question here now, Dan, is what happens to those gun buyers who early Thursday morning, because when I talked with them early Thursday, GAT Guns, I could hear in the background phones going off the hook, a buzz of activity. It sounded like there were hundreds of people in the background all milling about, and they said that they were having strong sales. And then literally an hour after I got off the phone with them, that stay on the injunction was issued, and they had to stop their sales. But what happens to those gun buyers who early Thursday went in, put money down, and purchased a gun? They have to wait 3 days to pick up their firearms in Illinois. And it's still an open question at this point. What happens to those gun sales? Now, if you flash back to January 10th, when Governor J.B. Pritzker enacted the gun and magazine ban, there was a provision in there that allowed for anybody who purchased a gun before the bill was enacted into law, they could still pick up their firearm. I don't think that's the case here. And gun stores say they have not been given any guidance from Illinois State Police about how to handle sales that may have already happened in the interim while the preliminary injunction was in place. So this obviously is an ongoing situation. That's just the Southern District case in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And the overall question about the constitutionality of this law, that still has yet to be dealt with. The preliminary injunction and the stay on that injunction are just the initial steps. We still have to go through the arguments of whether or not this is constitutional. And you've also got a case in Naperville that has been taken all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court for a request for a preliminary injunction. That's after the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals denied a preliminary injunction. And also, Dan, while those are the federal cases, the state cases, you've got the Illinois Supreme Court set to hear a challenge on the grounds of equal protections. That's going to be May 16th. And while the state ban has been stayed and put back in place, you've got temporary restraining orders for the thousands of others that are still in place on the state level cases. So there's a lot of moving pieces with this. We'll definitely keep people updated at thecentersquare.com.
Obviously, there's going to be plenty of developments, but we have time for one more story. So let's move on to that one. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot on Sunday, this past Sunday, sent a letter to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, pleading with him to stop sending migrants who have crossed into the United States illegally up to Chicago. Since President Biden took office, he's come under a big criticism for the massive amounts of illegal border crossings, both at ports of entry, but in between ports of entry, trying to evade capture. Texas, which has the longest southern border with Mexico, has taken on the brunt of those migrants who have crossed into the state. Last year, Governor Abbott, who said his state doesn't have the resources to deal with the millions of people who have crossed into Texas, started busing some of these migrants to so-called sanctuary cities, Chicago being one of them. Chicago's gotten a few thousand of those folks. The city now says it does not have the resources to deal with a few thousand migrants that are bused up to Chicago, asked Abbott to stop. Abbott told Lightfoot in a response letter that go to President Biden. He's the one that caused this crisis. What do you know?
Well, it's something that's costing Illinois taxpayers tens of millions of dollars, and the cost is expected to go even more high because of a policy that Illinois has in place covering the healthcare costs of undocumented residents in Illinois. Dan, all of this while the state sees continued out-migration of taxpayers. We had the IRS release their report on migration statistics showing that 100,000+ Illinois taxpayers left the state in the year that ended in 2020, and with them they took more than $10 billion in their taxable income. And while we see that continued out-migration, you're seeing an increase of undocumented migrants coming to Illinois. Now, I don't know if it outweighs how many people we're losing in the ultimate wash of those numbers, but the overall costs are very much numbers you can look at.
And all this when we just reported at thecentersquare.com this morning, too, that Illinois' April tax revenue plummeted. Man, it sort of seems like it's all coming together to form some sort of a fiscal time bomb. We will see. We will continue to cover this story, the ComEd 4 ramifications, and others at thecentersquare.com. But for Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.